All right, let's start some practice. We are going to work on respectively negation intro as our structuring subproof and then disjunction elimination as our structuring subproof. So notice that on the left hand side of your screen you see the argument negation C or negation D, and C as your premises, and then if you look down at the goal, you see negation D as your conclusion. And then on the right hand side of your screen, you see the same argument in a different Fitch window. So what I'd like us to do is, as I said, start with negation intro. So remember the two strategies that we discussed from chapter 6. The first strategy that we discussed was negation intro. So when your conclusion is a literal, that is a negated atomic sentence, or a negated sentence, or an atomic sentence, your strategy is negation intro. More specifically, most often, especially starting out, when your conclusion is a literal or an atomic sentence, you use negation intro. But I also said later in that same video that in discussing the second strategy, disjunction elimination, when you see a disjunction in your premises set up, disjunction elimination with the argument's conclusion as the goal of each of your subproofs. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. What matters, of course, is that your setup is correct and that the steps leading to your conclusion are correctly inferred, so justified correctly as well as cited correctly. But like I said, let's start with negation intro. So remember that you will use either Apple or Command P if you're using a Mac machine, or you will use Control P if you are using a Windows-based machine. If you want to use the drop-down menu, of course, you go to Proof and add Subproof. So I've got the start of my subproof. Remember, the plan with negation intro is that you assume the sentence that you want, from which you want to derive a contradiction, so that you can then exit the subproof and introduce the negation to that sentence. In this case, it's D. Now we'll add some lines after, and the end of our subproof is the contradiction. We exit the subproof and introduce the negation. So we see that we're using negation intro as our structuring subproof. Now, we don't know how many lines we will take to achieve the contradiction, which is why I structure the thing by asserting a few blank spaces in between the assumptive sentence and the conclusion of that assumptive proof, in this case, the contradiction. But once you've got the hang of things, I would just start out with the contradiction immediately after the assumptive sentence, in this case D. Then what you want to do is figure out what you're going to do next, knowing that what you seek is a contradiction. You'll notice that the left disjunct, that is not C, is contradicted in the second premise. And let me go ahead and show step numbers so that we can easily refer to the places in the derivation that I'm talking about at any given moment. So since we see that contradiction implicit, and we also see implicit the contradiction between our assumptive sentence D and the right side of the disjunction, we know that we are going to be able to generate a contradiction for each of these, but in order to do that, we're going to need to get not C and not D on its own. We also know that since we've got the disjunction in line 1, we will set up a disjunction elimination where we first assume one side of the disjunction at line 1, generate a contradiction, exit that subproof, assume the other side of the disjunction at line 1, namely not D, and we can infer from that a contradiction so that we get back out onto the structuring subproof that we began at line 3 to infer by way of the disjunction at line 1 and the successive subproofs from 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 to the conclusion at 8, which is the contradiction. So we eliminated the disjunction. Now remember, you can use your check step button to make sure that you've done things correctly. And recall that once you've achieved that contradiction at line 8, you are back out on line 9 to the end of the proof. We still, however, need to cite and justify lines 5 and 7. We already talked our way through the sequence. We said that 2 and the left side of the disjunction at line 1 are contradictories, but in order to make that contradiction explicit, we need the left disjunct on its own. We have the assumptive line 4 that allows us to separate out that disjunction. So the contradiction is introduced by way of 2 and 4. Then we got out of that nested subproof and immediately started the second half of the disjunction elimination sequence at line 6. And from line 6 and 3, we derived the contradiction at line 7. And notice when we first set things up, I mentioned that we were going to use negation intro, and I highlighted the subproof sequence, the structuring sequence, so that we could then assert that negation intro was our rule to be used, and we cited the lines. So we've already done that work, and now we can check our proof, and we see that we have been successful. So like I said, that's one way for us to complete this proof. Now let's move to the second version of the, let me rephrase that. Now let's move to the second iteration of the same argument and a different approach, another version of a derivation that will get us the same conclusion. Here again, we're looking at a structuring subproof, and in this case, we're looking at a disjunction elimination. So when you see a disjunction in your premises, you can set up disjunction elimination, in this case not C, and our goal here is the sentence not D. Why? Well, typically the goal or conclusion of each one of your successive subproofs when you apply the disjunction elimination rule is the conclusion of the argument. So once we achieve D, not D rather, we exit the subproof, begin a new subproof, and assume not D. Again, what we want is not D, so that we can exit the subproof, the second subproof, and conclude, therefore, from either side of the disjunction at line 1, we have proven the conclusion, in this case, negation D. So the structuring subproof is disjunction elimination. That's lines 1 3 to however many lines we're going to need to derive the conclusion, and 6 to 7 to derive the conclusion in the second subproof. Again, the rule, disjunction, elimination. Now, why do I know that we're only looking at a single inference from the assumption at line 6 to not D at line 7? Well, when we assume not D, we simply infer the reiteration of it at line 7. Then we need to fill in line 4. Notice that we have a contradiction between lines 2 and 3. So we assert the contradiction, and then recall also that from a contradiction anything follows, but we're tactical in what we say follows, right? From a contradiction anything follows, but you want to, that anything rather is going to be purposeful here. It's not just grabbing any sentence in the universe. It's typically the conclusion that you seek to that particular subproof. So we are eliminating the contradiction at line 5. So let's go ahead and check our proof, and we'll see that we get green check marks all the way down. All right, before moving on, let's just review what we've done in each of these derivations. We've taken one argument and we've derived the conclusion 2 different ways. You'll notice that the derivation of the conclusion in the second version is 1 step shorter than in the first version, that the logician is going to say is more elegant, but as long as it's logically valid, then we don't care if we take more steps than someone else might. So here we have 2 more Fitch windows open. You'll notice that the argument is the same in each window. The only difference is that the premises are flipped from the left side to the right side, or vice versa. In addition, I've also made the font size a little bit larger. It's typically easier to see. And I've also, as with the previous exercises that I worked, I made the lines darker, the proof lines darker. So we're going to do the same thing in this argument set as we did in the previous one. Namely, we're going to approach the strategy from the standpoint of negation intro and disjunction elimination. Again, remember, when your conclusion is an atomic sentence or a literal, negation intro is a go-to strategy. When you have a disjunction in your premises, disjunction elimination is a go-to strategy. So these you want to have pop first in your thinking when you come across an argument with those elements. All right, so the next thing you want to think about doing is looking at what else you've got in your argument. So notice here we have the contradiction of C and the contradiction of A in line 1 at line 2. So not C contradicts C, not A contradicts A. And so the idea here is to make those contradictions explicit. Why do we want to do that? Well, the goal, of course, is to achieve B. So if we say, okay, I can generate contradictions, and that then will allow me to achieve my conclusion, one, if not the first thought should be, I will use the strategy negation intro, and what that means is I assume my conclusion is false. So in this case, I assume that not B is true. From not B, I will generate a contradiction, and then I exit the subproof and introduce a negation. Now, since I already have a negation at line 3, in introducing a negation, I generate a second negation, which you will then eliminate. Now, typically in our homework exercises, you'll notice that Grade Grinder allows us to go from having generated a contradiction, in this case, let's say at line 6, to the affirmed sentence B at line 7. But what I'd like to do is not skip that step. Okay, so our structuring subproof in this example is negation intro, and the citations will be 3 through however many, or 3 through whatever the last line number it is that at which we've generated the contradiction. So with that in mind, we now go back up to the toward the top of our argument. We've assumed not B, and we can see that that contradicts B in line 1, but we need to make that contradiction explicit. The only way to do that is to eliminate the disjunctions at line 1. So that requires us to set up disjunction elimination. Assume A, we're going to want to generate a contradiction, exit that subproof. Assume B, generate a contradiction, exit that subproof. Finally, assume C, generate a contradiction, and then exit that subproof by way of disjunction elimination. So this disjunction is the result of eliminating the disjunction that we see in line 1, and then each of the disjunction elimination sequences, in this case nested subproofs, 3, until we get to the last contradiction, and then we're out. All right, so let's ride back up to the top. Line 4 assumes A is the case. We know that the right conjunct at line 2 contradicts A, so let's make that explicit by eliminating the conjunction from line 2. Then we assert the contradiction at line 6. And let me just leave the cursor over the the symbol for a moment. Notice that you get a pop-up window if you hover over the symbol for the given rule that you're choosing, and you can confirm that in fact you are employing this rule correctly. Let me, so we've got contradiction, introduction. Let's do the same just as a reminder for line 5. That was the elimination of the conjunction, and once again the rule pops up for us. Okay, moving on. Remember, anytime you want to cite and justify a given step in an inference, you're going to need to have your slider right next to the relevant line number. That is, to the line number you want to work on. All right, so we've completed the inference, or sorry, let me rephrase that. We've completed the first of the 3 disjunction elimination subproof sequences, and I'm just going to, actually I'm going to make the font a little bit smaller so that ideally we can get everything in a single screen, so we don't have to scroll back and forth. You want to be able to see the whole thing all at once. All right, so we finished the first sequence, the nested sequence at line 6. Now take a look at line 7. We've got the assumption that B is the case. Notice, though, that at line 3, we assumed that not B was the case. So not B and B are contradictories. We assert that contradiction at line 8. Let me also take a moment here to remind you that when you are within a nested sequence, or you're within a structuring subproof sequence, you can reach out to a nested sequence, or sorry, rephrase, you can reach out to, in this case, a structuring subproof sequence. You can also reach out to your premises while you're within a nested sequence. Similarly, if you are within a structuring sequence, you can reach out to the main line, that is to the premises. What you can't do, however, is this. Once you have discharged a subproof, whether it's a nested subproof or a structuring subproof, you can't reach back into that subproof in order to cite or justify a line outside of it that comes below it. That's because the nested subproof or the structuring subproof is a self-contained unit, and you are not allowed to go back into it once you've discharged it. I said a bit more about what it means to say you're not allowed to go back in a previous video, but I just want to remind you here. All right, so notice that at line 6, we achieved a contradiction. At line 8, we achieved a contradiction. And lastly, at in the final nested subproof sequence, we assumed C. We know that we have an implicit contradiction here at line 2. So what we're going to need to do is infer not C from the conjunction at line 2. We eliminate the conjunction. And now at line 11, we can assert the contradiction between 9 and 10. So we've now finished the nested subproof sequence. I'm going to make the font size a little bit smaller still. All right. So I'm down on line 12, and notice that line 12 takes us back onto the original structuring subproof that began at line 3, right? So 3 and 12 are on the same line. We achieved 12 by way of proving a contradiction from each of our disjuncts. Right? By assuming A, we got a contradiction. By assuming B, we got a contradiction. And by assuming C, we derived a contradiction. Notice also that earlier I had set that up, right? I had, while my cursor was on line 12, I clicked on line 1, and then I clicked on each of the disjunctional limb subproofs. And then once I achieved my contradiction, at line 12, now I exit the structuring subproof that is negation intro, and I assert that it's not the case that not B. In other words, the assumption not B is false. Finally, at line 14, I eliminate the negations at line 13. So here again, notice that if I hover over the negation symbol under the negation elimination rule, Fitch will display that rule for us. So I'm going to now verify the proof, and you'll see that we get green check marks all the way down. So this derivation took a total of 14 lines, including the 2 premises. Let's go ahead and move now over to the second iteration of the argument. And rather than use negation intro as my structuring subproof, I'm going to use disjunction elimination, with B as my goal for each of the subproofs. So I'm going to assume A, and what I want at the end of that subproof is B. Then I'm going to assume B, and I can say right now I'm just going to reiterate it. And that subproof assumes C, and what I want at the end of that subproof again is B, so that I can exit my structuring subproof and say from each of the disjuncts at line 2, I have proven B. The rule there, disjunction elimination. So when we're setting up our structuring subproof, we have in mind our conclusion, right? That's what we want to go for. Since we know that we're using disjunction elimination, we say, okay, what's the easiest way for me to achieve my conclusion with disjunction elimination? And it's going to be to assert or to infer rather, B in each one of the structuring subproofs. All right, so notice that line 3 has an implicit contradiction in line 1. So let's make that contradiction clearer by pulling down from line 1 by conjunction elimination. That is, I dismantled the conjunction at line 1 and I've got not A. From A and not A, I can infer there's a contradiction. Contradiction intro. Then at line 6, I infer B. Why? Because from a contradiction, anything follows, and what I want is B, so I'm allowed to assert it. I move on now to my second subproof. I assume B, therefore I have B. I reiterate line 7 at line 8. And then at line 9, I'm on the last of my disjunction elimination subproofs. I'm going to go ahead and make the font size smaller so we can see the whole. And we'll notice that line 9 has a contradiction with line 1's left conjunct. So let's make that contradiction clearer by dismantling line 1. Dismantling what? The conjunction. Eliminate the conjunction at line 1, and we get not C. So we can infer now, if we say C and we also say not C, in other words, if we have assumed and inferred C and not C, we can't have both because they are contradictories. So we introduce the contradiction. Once again, from a contradiction, anything follows. The rule for that is contradiction elimination. All right, so once more, I'm going to make the font size even smaller still. We now are in a position to verify that we have, by way of the structuring subproof disjunction elimination, achieved our goal. Verify, and yes, we've achieved it. Let me jump back over to our original version of the proof, which was negation intro. And if we went from the contradiction at 12 to the inference B, we will still get a check mark. It's just that Fitch allows us to skip the second negation. In other words, rather than introducing the negation at line 13 as we originally had done, which gives us 2 negations, which we then eliminate, we go straight to B. And you'll notice that the proof, the the number of lines in each one of our derivations is the same. Structurally, the second derivation is less complicated. But I think what's nice about what's nice about the first version of the derivation is that we can think about working backward. And I want to remind you in this way. If we look at line 12, we know that the contradiction was the goal of the structuring subproof that we began at line 3. Notice also that if we ignore line 13, right, if we say, okay, the conclusion that we want at line 12 is a contradiction, notice that working backward from that contradiction allows us to see that we're going to go for a contradiction in each one of our subproofs that was set off by the disjunction at line 1. So we're continuously working backward. When you set up a structuring subproof, as we did here at line 3 from 3 through 12, think about what the goal of that structuring subproof is. The conclusion of that structuring subproof should inform you what you're going to do next, where you may need a nested subproof using the structuring subproof's conclusion as the goal of the nested subproof. That's what we did here. I hope that this practice with the rules from Chapter 6 has been helpful. As usual, if you have questions, problems, confusions, let me know. But remember that we want to focus our thinking here in terms of strategies. More specifically, using negation intro and disjunction elimination as strategies for structuring our derivations.